Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or so to have everyone sort of filter in, and then we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining us over your lunch break. Give it a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to UCalgary's webinar From Isolation to Inclusion, How Diversity Drives Equitable Innovation. I'm Shanika Singho. My pronouns are she, her. I'm one of the founders of BESI and a proud UCalgary alumna, but I need to shout out my department. I'm an extremely proud grad from the Film Studies department. I am pleased to be your host for this webinar as part of Canadian Innovation Week. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge that even though we are all joining remotely, I am confident that every single one of us is residing on the traditional territories of at least one Indigenous nation. I express sincere gratitude for being able to call these lands where we work, live, and play our respective homes. I am located in Calgary, Canada, on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising of the Sitsiga, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Our guest moderator joins us today from Ottawa, which is built on the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Today marks the first day of Canadian Innovation Week for 2021. This week is an initiative from the Canadian Innovation Space. Powered by the Rideau Hall Foundation, Canadian Innovation Space is a partnership of cross-disciplinary organizations that strives to build a stronger, more resilient culture of innovation in Canada. UCalgary is proud to be a partner and wants to recognize both campus and community accomplishments, celebrate their achievements, and inspire the next generation of innovators. This year's theme is From Problems to Possibilities, and today's webinar, we will explore how innovators are reacting to the ever-changing world and making it a better, more inclusive space for all Canadians. I stumbled into entrepreneurship in 2019 and founded BESI alongside a few of my university friends. BESI originally was built to solve the problem of natural farmers not being able to compete at grocery stores. With our direct-to-consumer brand, BESI Box, which now serves Calgary and Edmonton, we have been able to help farmers and consumers eat and shop more ethically and locally. BESI has evolved too, though. We now provide software to farmers, breweries, consumer packaged goods brands, and more to help them scale their sales by owning their relationship with the end consumer. I've been in the innovation space now for nearly 2 years, and what I know for sure is that innovation can start with a conversation, but that means all people, including Black, Indigenous, and people of color, like myself, need a seat at the table and a welcome opportunity to share ideas. While this hasn't always been the case, Canada is taking steps in moving from isolation to inclusion of all innovators across the country. Now, I will pass it off to today's moderator to introduce our panelists. Jill Clark is the Manager of Communications and Media Relations at the Rideau Hall Foundation. She is a seasoned moderator and MC and was the Master of Ceremonies for the 2020 Toronto Global Forum. Her work at the Rideau Hall Foundation includes the Michener Award for Public Service Journalism, Public Relations for the Right Honorable David Johnson, and several other team-based initiatives toward building a smarter, more caring Canada. Jill, want to take it away?
Thank you so much, Shanika. I really look forward to hearing more about all of your great work, both in business and in community when we get to our Q&A portion a little bit later. Thank you so much. Now in its 4th year, Canadian Innovation Week is highlighting innovators in all fields across the country who are taking us from problems to possibilities, making our country smarter, healthier, kinder, and better. The Rideau Hall Foundation is partnering with the University of Calgary to bring you 2 such innovators who are driving a more inclusive and diverse innovation ecosystem, recognizing that better can mean different things for all of us. Please feel free to enter questions into the Q&A tab for our Q&A portion a little bit later. We would love to hear from you. So I'll start by introducing our 2 very distinguished panelists today. Dr. Gideon Christian, PhD professor, Faculty of Law of the University of Calgary. Dr. Christian's research on algorithmic racism focuses on racial bias arising from the use of AI in risk assessments for reoffending in the criminal justice system. For Dr. Christian, algorithmic racism is defined as race-based bias arising from the use of AI-powered tools in the analysis of data in the decision-making process, resulting in unfair outcomes to individuals from a particular segment of society characterized by race. We also welcome Dr. Jennifer Adams, PhD professor, Workland School of Education, Faculty of Science at the University of Calgary, and Creativity and STEM Canada Research Chair. Dr. Adams is head of a new research project that will explore experience of BIPOC students pursuing science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM majors at Western Canadian post-secondary institutions. Additionally, the study will shed light on the reasons why this community remains underrepresented in both STEM learning and in the workforce. So, Dr. Christian, I'll start with you. Your research is all about algorithmic racism in the criminal justice system. Can you tell us more about that, what that really means, and if you could, maybe some of the risks that algorithmic bias has when it comes to criminal justice?
Thank you, Shanika, and thank you very much, Jill, for having me. And with regards to my research on algorithmic racism focuses on the use of artificial intelligence technology in recidivism risk assessment in the criminal justice system. And by recidivism risk assessment, I'm referring to the process of determining the likelihood that individuals in the criminal justice system will reoffend. And by individuals in the criminal justice system, I'm talking about accused, convicted, and incarcerated persons. So recidivism risk assessment, or the process, is actually aimed at determination of the appropriate limitation on the freedom of the subject, because individuals have charter rights. So recidivism risk assessment determines justification and extent their charter rights should be restricted, especially by incarceration. And recidivism risk assessment is used in various aspects of the criminal justice system. It is used at the pre-trial stage. It is used at the sentencing stage. It is also used at post-sentencing stages of the system. At the pre-trial stage, it is used to determine whether an accused person should be incarcerated or be out on bail while their matter is being heard or while they are being tried. So the likelihood that such a person will reoffend is very important in making that determination. Because if an accused person is likely or very likely to reoffend, then it is most likely that such person or accused person should be incarcerated while their matter is being determined or while they are trial. And if they pose low risk of reoffending, then it serves no societal interest to lock them up while their matter or their guilt is being determined. In the case of a convicted person, this risk assessment is also important in determining the extent of their incarceration. So in the criminal justice system, you have some crimes that normally have a low range of sentence and high range of sentence. And judges have discretion in determining where among this range should a convicted person fall in. So for individuals who are most likely to reoffend, there's higher likelihood that they should fall on the high range of the sentence, whereas if they are less likely to reoffend, then there's likelihood that they will fall on the lower range. Now, in the case of post-sentencing, that is when the accused has been convicted and sentenced, risk assessment is also important in determining where they should be incarcerated, whether they should be in maximum security, medium, or low security prisons. So their likelihood of reoffending is important, or that determination of likelihood of reoffending is important in making this decision. Now, how does innovation and artificial intelligence come in here? Well, with innovation in technology, especially in the area of artificial intelligence technology, recidivism risk assessment tools built on AI technology are now well developed and used in the criminal justice system around the world, especially on the south side of our border, the United States. So what my research does is my research studies the extent to which these artificial intelligence technology tools used in recidivism risk assessment, the extent to which they reinforce implicit and explicit bias against minority groups, especially Blacks, who now constitute disproportionate population in the criminal justice system in North America. So the research seeks to develop the concept of algorithmic racism, of course, which has been defined earlier as a systemic race-based bias arising from the use of AI-powered tools in the analysis of data and decision-making process, resulting in unfair outcome to individuals from particular segments of the society characterized by race. So the objective of the research, of course, is to develop a legal framework that will enhance the efficiency, fairness, transparency, and accountability in the use of these AI tools in the criminal justice system in Canada. Now, talking about the risk posed by algorithmic bias or these tools, the fact is that AI technologies are trained and they rely heavily on big data to make predictions. Now, some of the data that are used to train this technology are historical data from eras of mass incarceration, biased policing, biased bail and sentencing regime characterized by systemic discrimination against particular sections of the community or the society characterized by race. And of course, Canada is not immune from problems associated with data from biased policing, as evidenced from the decade-old practice of carding, which is practiced by many police departments. And of course, Toronto, Edmonton, and Halifax are notorious for this practice, which has been routinely criticized as disproportionately targeting Black and Indigenous people. And if I may continue, another risk also posed by is the fact that the historical data used to train these AI risk assessment tools using the criminal justice system may be blind to recent risk reduction and anti-discrimination legislative and policy framework that were aimed at addressing the overrepresentation of certain segments of the societies in the criminal justice system. So that's another risk. These data are blind to these risk reduction technologies. Then you talk about explicit versus implicit racism. Unlike explicit racism, which is self-evident and obvious, algorithmic racism is not overtly manifest. It is buried and obscured in data. And what do I mean by this? If a judge says, well, Mr. Jamal, because Mr. Jamal, I'm going to sentence you to 5 years in prison as opposed to 3 years in prison. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because you are Black. That would be a clear case of explicit racism. You can't even imagine that happening in our criminal justice system. But you have a situation whereby AI technology will make a recommendation that Mr. Jamal poses a high risk and hence should be sentenced to high term because Mr. Jamal comes from a race. And that race, based on data that I have analyzed, people from that race are more likely to reoffend. So these are two different conclusions. I mean, conclusion coming from the same different ways, but the same end. We frown at one because we know it's there. We don't frown at the other because we don't even know that it existed or that it has occurred. So we have a belief system, that tend to portray technology as being race neutral and colorblind, which is wrong because technology does not act independently. The data used in training the technology determines the prediction made by the technology. And hence, when we are using these predictions in the criminal justice system, it is very important that we be careful about this technology and the assessment they make so that we don't continue to kind of propagate these stereotypes in the criminal justice system.
Thank you so much. It's so fascinating, and I mean, we're here to talk about innovation, and why would you say, in your own words, your research and all of this study into the apparent inherent racism of AI? What is the innovation there? How is that innovated? How is that relevant to us today?
Yeah, it is innovative because, well, in the Canadian criminal justice system today, AI technology is not being used. It's not currently being used in recidivism risk assessment. But considering the fact that almost every state south of our border, that is in the US, either they are currently using the technology or they are currently contemplating using the technology in their criminal justice system, one can safely predict that it is only a matter of time before Canada follows the trend. But before that happens, it is important for us to develop a legal framework to address these problems associated with the use of this technology in our criminal justice system. And personally, as a member of a racial group that stands to be seriously impacted by possible deployment of this technology in the Canadian criminal justice system, I thought it is I have a moral responsibility to examine the issues related to racial bias arising from the use of this technology. And that's, of course, one of the motivations for my research. And also, this research is innovative because the use of AI in the criminal justice system represents a new era of scientifically guided sentencing, which replaces the current arbitrary human decision-making. And of course, yes, the empirical or scientifically guided predictions are more accurate, or they tend to replace arbitrary human decision. But the fact also is that even this accurate scientific methodology is also fraught with bias, racial bias that must be researched and addressed for this technology, so as to ensure that this technology does not technologically replicate human bias, which is very common and arbitrary. So I think in this aspect, the research kind of seems to bring out the innovative aspect of use of artificial intelligence tools in the criminal justice system in Canada.
So well said. Thank you so much. And yes, really a testament to creating more inclusive systems in all sectors across the country. I remind everybody, please send your questions in to Dr. Christian. There is so much left to unpack here, and we really appreciate you telling us a little bit more about your research. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now we go to Dr. Jennifer Adams, who is exploring the experiences of Black and Indigenous students who are pursuing careers and studies in STEM. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Adams. Nice to see you.
Yes, and thanks, Jill, and thanks, Shanika, for your introduction as well.
Great. So you've started this research project experiencing the experience of racialized students in STEM in Canada. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, well, so in general, my research has always been focused on, well, it focuses on STEM learning environments with an emphasis on equity and social justice. This for me is both in the belonging of diverse learners in STEM learning environments, and also expanding science learning so that it's situated in the lived experiences and communities of learners. In the United States, there's been much data on racial equity in STEM. However, there's still a long way to go to achieve this equity, but the data does exist in the United States. However, I noticed in Canada that the racial inequity exists in the visible lack of diversity in STEM classes and departments, but the data that supports this does not exist. As some Canadian researchers of color have already pointed out, that the data that correlates race with education is almost non-existent, and it is critical if we are going to think about addressing diversity in STEM. So to move towards racial equity in STEM education and in education more broadly, we need to have data so that we know when the needle has moved. Furthermore, we need to know how Black and Indigenous students here in Canada and in the United States as Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students, how they experience their STEM education, from the kinds of learning experiences that they have access to in primary and secondary schools, to what happens to them when they reach post-secondary level. We also need to know the experiences of racialized scientists in universities, including the funding structures, like how and if and how their research gets funded, so that we understand those structural barriers that contribute to racial inequities. Questions that we need to ask are like, how prepared are students to enter post-secondary STEM? So thinking about their secondary education. What experiences do students have in colleges and university that either contribute to their sense of belonging and flourishing, or have caused them to get pushed out of STEM? What are the systemic challenges that racialized scientists experience in achieving tenures, grant publication, and et cetera? And what are the structures that are necessary to achieve an authentic level of equity in STEM?
Wow, there's just so much there, and I'm sure the research just kind of goes and deeper and deeper and deeper. So, what to you makes this research so important?
Well, it's important because in order, just as, Dr. Christian was just discussing, in order for us to move our science, our science, creativity, and innovation forward, we need to have diverse perspectives brought to the table. Because if we think about the STEM fields, it's where knowledge is produced, and it plays a very critical role in shaping our society. If we think about it, science and technology has shaped societies and human culture since we first harnessed fire. So we look at the technology that many of us hold in our hands, and we can reflect on the ways that this has changed who we are as a global society. We also witness here in Canada and in the United States and around the world, people have different experiences with these advantages that largely fall along racial and socioeconomic lines, with those two often intersected. And Dr. Christian has just pointed out about that connection between AI and biases. Like, all of the AI is trained around, against like the dominant culture, against certain like data sets that are not reflective and respectful of diversity. diversity. Most of us, a lot of us in the sciences, we've had to read the seminal Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in this book, he examines the trajectory of scientific advances and notice that they do not happen as a result of accumulated facts. And this is unfortunately how it's still often taught in secondary and in entry-level post-secondary classes, that it's a bunch of facts that you have to memorize and know, and this is what science is. But he pointed out that it's through intellectual circumstances and possibilities. So for a long time, racialized people, especially Black and Indigenous people, have faced like barriers to entry that have been high for a variety of reasons. So such as that, the perceptions, such as perceptions that, Black people cannot do science. Black people and Indigenous people, women also experience racism and microaggressions in pursuit of science, not having supportive mentors. And just to name a few of these, so our perspectives and our intellectual strategies have largely been absent from these technological innovations, that have defined our society. Now is the time to really change this. Much research has already shown that diverse teams produce greater creativity and innovation. Research has always also shown that although scientists of color produce the most innovation, their research is less taken up than that of their white male counterparts. This means that we as a society are missing the creativity and innovation contributions of Black and Indigenous scholars. With our contemporary complex issues, we need a range of lenses to solve these problems and ensure that the solutions are relevant to a wide range of people.
So we definitely know that, the innovators are there, that there is no shortage of brain trust when it comes to Black and Indigenous and innovators of color. So what can we do to support them? How can we support this kind of flourishing cohort of diverse people in STEM?
Yeah, and that's the question that we're all addressing. Like there's knowledge about it. We know what are the ways that we can do it. It's a matter of doing it. So first, we need to think about students in their formal schooling, ensure that all students in schools have access to effective and engaging science learning opportunities, both inside and out of school. So this also means up-to-date labs and science learning that connects students to their communities and lived experiences. I've done a lot of research in informal science learning and find that that is a very salient place for students of color to really learn how to engage with and develop positive identities around science. So making those connections between informal and formal schooling is very, very important. So we need to foster the training of diverse science teachers in schools so that students start to have image early on about what scientists and people who are associated scientists could look like. There is this, famous or seminal research that's called the Draw a Scientist test. And when students still take it today, they still tend to draw the white male scientist in the lab coat with the crazy hair and the beakers and test tubes. And that needs to change where, there are scientists that are not only practicing in the lab, but out in the field and doing things, and also reflective of different genders and different racial identities, different socio and economic status. So students should be drawing these scientists to be more reflective of themselves. And my research has shown that it's important to expose students to different science-related careers that range from the bench scientist, as I've just mentioned, or doctor, to science communication, science illustration, science policy, so that there are different ways to practice science or have science-related careers. The important thing for me is that when students reach the post-secondary level, we have to create spaces of belonging. We have to challenge these perceptions of who can do and who cannot do science. Researchers show that these biases do exist for women, Black, Indigenous, Latinx people, people from lower income backgrounds, people with disabilities, people with diverse gender identities, and people at the intersection of these multiple social identities. It is in the literature. But we in post-secondary education have to ensure that we are creating learning environments that are welcoming to all bodies and perspectives. And because this is how we will together solve complex issues and contribute to a broader range of innovation. The important thing is that we change institutions to fit the people and not the other way around, not changing people to fit into the institutions.
Thank you so much. I love how you illustrate that, science is never just one thing. It can be research, it can be policy, it can be education, and also the fact that scientists aren't just one type of person. It's no longer just that old white man in the lab coat with the crazy hair. It looks like everyone. It looks like all of us. And I love the intersection between the two of those things. Thank you so much. Thank you both to our panelists. I would love to open the floor now to some questions from you, from our audience. I'd also like to welcome Shanika back as well to give her perspective as an entrepreneur, as an innovator in her own right, doing the work out in the world today. So I welcome the three of you to help answer some questions that we've got from our audience today. So Dr. Christian, I have a question for you. If AI can be adjusted to be less biased, can it help with human bias? Do you hope that these innovative changes will produce results that can assist in making real change in human areas, such as policing?
Okay, thanks for the question. You see, the problem seems to be AI can be adjusted. AI on its own, it's not biased, but it becomes biased when it has been trained with a biased data. So it's a case of what the computer engineers call, the computer terminology, garbage in, garbage out. If you feed garbage to the technology, it will regurgitate garbage. If you feed racist data to AI, it will make racist prediction. It will regurgitate that. So the problem here is the feeling the impression we tend to have with regards to the predictions made by this technology. We tend to accept this prediction without questioning them. And that is where we have a big problem. Let me give you an example. In the criminal justice system, if an expert is to testify in the criminal justice system, there are several hurdles that has to be crossed or overcome by this expert before their testimony can be accepted as expert testimony. First, they have to show that they are experts, not just experts, but experts in the field they want to testify. Secondly, when they have given their expert testimony, so maybe somebody comes and say, hey, I'm a behavioral scientist, I think I can predict that this person is highly likely to reoffend. So after they have established their expertise, then they give their evidence. When they give their evidence, the opposing party is allowed to cross-examine them to seek to put doubt into that evidence. And if they fail to do that, of course, the court accepts the evidence. Now, when the court accepts the evidence, even the judge has the discretion to determine whether to accept that evidence or to even throw it away. And if they choose to accept it, how much weight will they attach to that evidence? Now, these are constitutional protection aimed at, preserving the rights of the accused. But now, reverse the situation whereby instead of a human making that prediction that this accused person is likely to reoffend, an AI technology is making that prediction. Once the AI technology makes the prediction, we don't have any opportunity to examine or cross-examine the technology as we would of a human. Because the AI technology is a black box. We have zero knowledge as to how it operates. And yet we tend to place so much weight to the technology. And this is, of course, related to what behavioral scientists refer to as anchoring, a process whereby, a kind of cognitive bias that arises from human tendency to, rely on available piece of data rather than without giving consideration to any flaws or error that may be embedded in that data. So in the case of prediction made by AI technology, it is very important that officers in the justice system, whether the police, the judge, the correctional officers, determine what weight to attach to that prediction, rather than accepting that prediction as complete and accurate and unbiased. It is important to put it in proper perspective. Use that prediction along with some other factors relevant in order to make a determination, rather than relying solely on the AI technology or the AI prediction. I think in this way, we will be able to use the prediction in the proper perspective, while at the same time, minimizing human bias that comes along with in the criminal justice system.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Shanika, I'm going to bring it over to you. You are a young woman of color working in the innovation space in a very white male-dominated space of farmers and agriculture and food. So it seems like you would be up against a lot of barriers, both systemic and otherwise. And I'm sure as well, you've found a really great community. So could you tell us a little bit about both of those things, both the barriers that have maybe been a challenge to overcome, and also the community that has helped you get to where you are?
Yeah, of course. I got into the space not knowing that there would be as many barriers as there has been. I will say naively, I'll own that fact. I am one of one that I've met so far in the last 2 years of being in this space, and especially at a co-founding level. So it's been an incredible challenge. However, I have an incredible team of advisors, and that has been incredibly amazing for me in my career. But I also will say my co-founders are 2 white men, and they are acutely aware of their privilege when we go into meetings or into rooms, and they are the first person to call out something if they see that it's not right, and they're the first person to acknowledge that things are not working right. And they always say that they have their, as much as they're well read and everything like that, that they have their white male goggles on, and that they're going to do everything they can to get educated. So I've been able to leverage their privilege in many ways to have some challenging conversations and to get into rooms that other women may not have been able to get into. In terms of community, there's specific organizations. So Platform Calgary is one of the best communities I find in not just here in our province, but across the country, just with their programming and their supports. There's a great group that I'm on the community council for diversity, inclusivity, and equity, the 51 Collective, which is all about unlocking venture capital for women. But as a woman of color, I'm holding them accountable to BIPOC women and making sure that there's representation there. So I would say those are the small groups. And then of course, my general group, my friends, my family, they've been in my corner the whole way in moments that I came home frustrated about a meeting where a white man didn't take me seriously. My co-founders had my back, and so did my family and my friends.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's really wonderful. Dr. Adams, I'm going to bring it back over to you. We have a question asking, how do we start collecting data in Canada, like in the US, in relation to the education of BIPOC STEM students? So how can BIPOC stakeholders and business owners be part of the education and learning environments for students in secondary and post-secondary education?
Well, I think for one thing, it does start with funding. So that means that, at the national level, there should be funding that's earmarked for research projects that are both collecting quantitative and qualitative data on the connection between Black, Indigenous students of color and their educational attainment. Business partners, those that are philanthropists, can also do that. There's a lot of, there's funding, private agencies that also fund that research, because without both the funding and the research priority for diversity, without those two things there, then it's really hard to move that forward, because right now it's like individual researchers that are doing this work across Canada. Like in my own like I guess literature review, we found some, dissertations and things like that talk about the experiences, but there is not this widespread effort to collect the systemic data that shows the connection between not only race and education attainment, but also socioeconomic status, gender, all of these different things. Now, there's been some research, but it doesn't really, it doesn't break it down into race, which is very important, because we know that there is anti-Black racism that exists. We know that there is a historical suppression of Indigenous voices. So we really need to see how people are faring in school, both from primary, secondary, up to the post-secondary level. And we need to have those numbers to see how different types of programs are working at helping advancing diversity, because without those numbers, we will not know. Like, I found that it was very interesting also that when I was collecting or looking for data, that even looking at different university websites, there really wasn't any data, that you didn't even know how many Black students were even there at the post-secondary level. So let alone in the STEM majors and careers. And these are all like very important things. So I think we need to have both like a, quantitative data efforts. I'm not really a quantitative researcher. I'm more of a qualitative narrative researcher, but we do need to have that quantitative data to show the numbers of who's pursuing what relative to the larger population. And then we also need the qualitative data that describes the experiences that people have, so that we know what systemic and structural barriers that they are coming against, so that we can work hard as a society to change them.
And just as a follow-up, how do we connect these dots? How do we move from data collection into action?
Well, it has to be something that's happening at once, like there's people that work in either a design-based research or research to practice type of framework, where as you're learning, you're also implementing, and then you're involving stakeholders in that research process. So for example, while students who are in the STEM fields, they can be also involved in like saying, yeah, these are how my this is how these experiences or these issues of microaggressions or bias and things have affected my experiences. These are some suggestions how we can change them. And it's not that we're putting the onus on, people of color to make changes, because as Chanika just mentioned, we need allies. We need people that are going to be, standing there with us to make these changes, whose voices are going to be heard even more so than ours at the moment. But we need those people that are there as allies to make these changes, because we are, as the Black and Indigenous people, we did not put these structures in place. So we alone cannot change these structures. So again, it has to be a broad community-based effort. So as we're learning, and then there's data already from the United States, like, that talks about these structural biases, which from the qualitative and, dissertation-based data, it really is not showing that there is much difference in that regards. So we already have an idea of what's happening. So now it's a matter of changing the culture, changing how we think about people of color in science, changing how we think about the teaching and learning context, changing about what we think that science knowledge and knowledge production is, in order to help and move us forward, with a more like diverse scientific population.
Thank you so much. I'd like just to call attention, our UCalgary's Vice Provost of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Dr. Melinda Smith, has just dropped into the Q&A tab some really great resources from the University of Calgary that may be of interest to the audience. The links of which are there to see what the university themselves is doing. So that's, I think, another great concrete example of how we're getting from data collection to action. So thank you so much to the Vice Provost for that. Now, I'd like to ask a question of all of you. I mean, as people who are operating, people of color operating in the research space, in the innovation and entrepreneurship space, how would you suggest to best advocate for more voices in your fields of research or in your sectors of business? Dr. Christian, how would you suggest that more Black and Indigenous people of color become a part of this dismantling of the AI system within the criminal justice system?
Thanks, Jill. I think I will start by acknowledging the fact that one of the reasons why we have the problem of algorithmic racism and algorithmic bias is because we have less individuals from this particular segment of the society working in that field. Dr. Adams has emphasized earlier the need of bringing diversity to the table. The AI industry is predominantly white, is predominantly male, and that industry tends to replicate itself in its products. There's no doubt about that. So I think one of the best ways of being able to address the problem of algorithmic racism and algorithmic bias in recidivism risk assessment tools, AI-powered tools, is to have diversity in the individuals designing this technology. So, and not just having the diversity, but also ensuring that the data used in this technology accurately reflect the society in which this technology will be deployed. And I emphasize on this because if a particular segment of the society is overrepresented in the data, that's going to be a problem. If they are underrepresented, it is also a problem. So I think the starting point, like I said, it's having more diversity in the STEM field, especially when it comes to design of artificial intelligence technology. Bringing diversity to the table will be one way to start addressing the issue of bias arising from artificial intelligence technology. And when I'm talking about artificial intelligence technology, the research I'm currently discussing focuses mainly on, recidivism risk assessment, but it's not just in this field alone. If we go to other fields like facial recognition technology, that is another whole world on its own with similar, if not much bigger problem. False identification and false positives. There was a particular case studied by ACLU, which was based on Amazon facial recognition technology. That facial recognition technology falsely identified 28 US lawmakers as people who were previously arrested for a crime. And most of the people that were identified were actually lawmakers of color, including the prominent civil rights legend, John Lewis. John Lewis was also identified by that facial recognition technology as someone who has previously been arrested for a crime. So this is a huge problem. It is a huge problem, and the unfortunate thing about it is that it's not a problem that is openly out there. It becomes evident maybe when you have a particular research conducted or a particular case of news report focusing on maybe something has gone wrong, then you have a news report. So, like I said, bringing diversity to the table is important. Making sure that the data used in training the technology adequately and accurately represent the population that technology is going to be deployed is also important.
Thank you. Dr. Adams, same question. Getting more Black and Indigenous people of color in your field, how do we do it?
Well, the way that we do it first is, again, I will go back to the changing the institutional structures, so making sure that all students feel welcome in science classes, make sure that they feel that all of they can be included, they can be their authentic selves, and they don't have to assimilate into a certain culture or they have to be inauthentic in order to participate in science. So that means that for both faculty, department structures, they need to check their biases. They need to look at how students are, getting accepted or filtered or tracked into different types of, programs. What's happening at the entry level courses? How are learners integrated in those entry level courses? What types of experience are they having that will allow them to feel both prepared and both included in order to advance to the upper level courses. So when students are working in collaborative groups, are students allowed to hear their voices? In one of my research projects, one young lady who was in a museum-based program and felt a very strong sense of community there and was able to network not only with her peers, but with scientists at the museum. When she moved into a science program at a university, she was the only Black student there. She felt excluded from study groups. She never, even when she raised her hands in lectures, she was not called upon to give answers and things like that. If it wasn't for that, that strong identity and network that she developed at the museum, she probably would not have survived that experience. And not to say that, again, not placing the onus on the museum-based or informal science learning, but that institution should have had structures in place to help support her, such as having like maybe a diverse students, science unions. I mean, there are many different broad solutions that we could talk about, but it's really up to, faculties of science, science departments to really get together and to talk about and to look at existing literature and to talk about, well, what makes sense in our context? What can we do here to make sure that we are attracting diverse students to our programs, and also that we are doing what we need to do in order that they flourish in these spaces? Because if Black and Indigenous students are flourishing, that means that all students are flourishing.
I love that. Thank you so much. And Shanika, what do you think it would take to see more women like you, more racialized women in the entrepreneurship and innovation space?
The biggest thing is access to resources. So my answer is very similar to our other two lovely speakers. The venture capital, so funding for startups, dropped significantly in 2020, just given what we've all been going through. But the portion that went to women was 2.2%. For anyone racialized, it was significantly less than that. So it's access to early stage funding and then venture funding. And the way to do that, again, is echoing what guest speakers have said, is changing the structure of them and really looking at, does having a venture capital fund or any fund that's run by a bunch of white men even make sense anymore? If we're trying to empower more women or anyone that's BIPOC, what does that even look like? I also would say we need to change how we make that stuff accessible. So early stage capital, a lot of the time, to be considered an actual person that can fund, so to give up your money to something like that, there's a huge barrier there. There's a lot of BIPOC people that cannot invest in startups, which generally have a higher return than your regular investments because there isn't access there. There's a lot of businesses. There's a company called Front Funder that's trying to change that, changing the model by crowdfunding. But again, it comes back to that systemic change where we need to change from the top down how we're providing access to startups, but then also empowering everyday people to actually fund businesses. And then I would say, lastly, it comes down to visibility. I'm one of one. I've done tons of panels compared to my co-founders for a reason. I want more young women to see me and to see, hopefully, that they can do what I do and honestly build something even better. But we need to be given those opportunities and, well, as we mentioned before, a seat at the table to have these conversations.
Thank you so much, Shanika. That's great. I want to thank both of our panelists so much, Dr. Christian and Dr. Adams, for sharing their research with us today, talking a little bit about the ecosystem and the landscape of innovation and research here in Canada. Shanika, I am going to turn it over to you. I'd like to thank you as well for sharing your perspective as well, as somebody who is a boots on the ground, real life entrepreneur who is making a much more representative and reflective environment for everyone. So thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Jill, Dr. Adams, Dr. Christian. This was a great discussion and a very important one to kick off Canadian Innovation Week. There is plenty more taking place this week, so check out ucalgary.ca/community to learn what's happening across campus, and for activities happening across the country, you can visit canadianinnovationspace.ca/Innovation Week. Today's session was recorded and the link will be shared in the post-event email along with all other resources from our lovely panelists discussed today, so keep an eye on your inbox. Thank you everyone for joining us today and have a great day.